The pre-Socratics are the first philosophers, and to say that they're the first philosophers might be misleading because it might suggest that there was no philosophy or no attempt to explain reality prior to that. But what actually was happening was that there were a group of people called the they weren't a group, but people were mainly through a method of just mythology, that through storytelling, through folklore, that they were conveying truths about the world and trying to understand the world. But what happens is the pre-Socratics come along, and they're no longer pleased with just telling stories, but rather they want to directly address it and try to explain it in concrete explanations. Instead of saying, like, why is this wrong, and telling a story, they're going to say, well, this leads to this consequence and that consequence. Where did fire come from? Instead of telling you a story about, stealing fire from the gods, they will instead tell, a theory about what fire is. And so that becomes a very different approach to the pre-Socratics from the mythological background. Now, the closest thing, one thing that oftentimes happens with mythology versus the pre-Socratics is that the pre-Socratics are philosophers, and mythology is also trying to do that, but it's through storytelling. It's through the attempt to do it via story and via explanation through symbolic storytelling. Probably the closest equivalence we would have in our own modern society would be folklore. In our modern society, we have folklore, which is essentially the same approach, the same attempt. That you sometimes get these stories that kind of urban legends, and they're attempting to tell some truth about the world through a story form. And that's sort of what mythology is. It's a highly symbolic story trying to tell you some truth about the way the world is. And so when you hear it, don't think of it as just these fantastic stories that, are about, gods and people stealing fire and doing things like that. Instead, these are trying to convey truths about the world to people who would understand those stories and relate to them. The example of this would be, I could come up with various folkloric or urban legends. There's some from academia where, there's a professor who goes to give an exam in a big lecture hall, and there's a student who's clearly cheating and looking up things in the book. And when the student goes to turn in his or her exam, the professor says, "I'm sorry, but I saw you cheating." And the student says, "Okay." And he says, "Well, I won't accept your exam." And he says, "Well, do you know who I am?" And the professor says, "No." He says, "Well, good." And he takes the exam, he shoves it in the middle of the pile of exams, and he takes it and he knocks it over, and they go flying. He can't tell where he went, and he runs out of the room. So the professor has no choice but to accept all the tests or to accept none of the tests. And so, the student ends up passing because of that. And this is a symbolic story that's, telling a variety of things. It's kind of like, it's a classic story about how, the student can dupe the teacher, but it's also a symbolic story about, how, sometimes academia can be faceless, and sometimes it can be, it can lack connections, and that's something that professors should do, and that in light of that, that's something that students can take advantage of, and that we can always do that in this sort of world. I think that kind of is a story kind of comes from a larger university rather than Lincoln Land, where I do know most of my students. Online classes, I may not be able to recognize you if I saw you on the street, but in a real class, or a physical class, these are real classes, but in a physical location class, I would likely, I would have no problem recognizing and knowing who you were. Now, another example of this is one that I always like, is where there's one about, I always like to give a couple of these folkloric stories. Another one I like is this one about this couple, and some of you may say, "Oh, that happened nearby here," and they go out into the countryside to some sort of lover's lane type place, and they're sitting down, they're out there in this, park their car, and they're going to do what lovers do in a secluded place on these streets, and they're out there and they're getting ready, they're kissing or whatever, and suddenly across the radio the music stops and it goes, "We have a late breaking announcement. A man has escaped from the insane asylum." And the man who has escaped from the insane asylum has a hook for a hand. He does not have hands, rather has only a hook, and he has been known to kill people with that hook. And so the female says, "That's only like a mile from here. We should leave." And the male says, "Come on, we don't need to be worried." And and so he's kind of protesting, and maybe they go back. And then there's another announcement: beep 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 beep. But warning, this person is dangerous. Anybody in the area should leave. Blah blah blah. And the female gets upset. She says, "No, I want to go home. I want to go home." She protests, and finally the guy says, "Well, forget it." And he shoves down the gas, and he spins out, and he heads home. When he gets home, back to her place to drop her off, he goes around as a gentleman to open her door, and even though he was mad, they've made up apparently on the drive. And he goes around to open her door, and when he gets around to the door, there's a bloody hook hanging from it. Apparently, in the process of taking off suddenly, he has pulled the hook off of this person who was just about to open the door and it killed them. And so there's a little bit of, just on a very basic level, this is a story that would intend to scare. You hear the story and you're going, oh my gosh, if I go out and I need to be careful, I go out into the country, I go onto a lover's lane, you can tell your daughters this story and they're going to be scared and they're going to be hesitant to go out there. But on a more symbolic level, it also is saying, here, the countryside, the lover's lane, teenagers engaging in activities of the sort in the countryside is something we frown upon by society. Say, go out to the countryside. The countryside is sort of seen as, beyond the constructs of society where there's roads and streets and order. And they've gone out into the countryside and they're breaking the rules. But what happens is the radio broadcasts in a message from town or their conscience saying, hey, take heed, be careful, this is dangerous, you shouldn't be out there, you could get pregnant and that could hurt you, I could end up, you're 16, you don't want to become pregnant, you could end up, with a disease or other things, so get out of there. And so, but in this case, the scary thing is this hooked man, and what it's basically saying is, on a basic level, it's trying to scare them. On a more symbolic level, it's trying to tell them, heed the rules of society because danger lurks when you go beyond the city and try to do other things. And so when you see mythology, it's doing the same thing. But where the pre-Socratics come along is they no longer are happy with the symbolic storytelling, the folkloric storytelling. Instead, they want a more literal approach to truth. They want to be able to say, don't go out there into the countryside, you'll get diseases, you'll get pregnant, etc. Very straightforward, whereas the mythology is an effort through story to do it. And that's sort of where the difference occurs, is there's more of a literal, straightforward approach trying to give information.